Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Melinda Hartwig. I'm the curator of ancient Egypt, Nubia, and Near Eastern art here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum. It's wonderful to see so many of you out here today on what is an extraordinary day. I do have to say, we didn't even know if we would be doing this up until Thursday because we thought that Hurricane Ian would be coming our way. And thankfully he passed by, and our thoughts and prayers with those people who felt the destruction of the hurricane. It is my pleasure to start the ball rolling on this really exciting program. ARCE, American Research Center in Egypt, for which I served as president for a number of years, and I'm still on the board, is doing a lecture tour in conjunction with the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun. So we are very, very lucky to have Betsy Bryan with us. I would ask you all if you would become members of ARCE and I'm sorry, ARCE, and also with my Carlos hat, I would love it if you would be members of, you would become members of the museum, because a number of these events we do broadcast through social media and also through direct mailings. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Louise Bertini, Executive Director of the American Research Center in Egypt, visiting from Cairo. Dr. Bertini has served as ARCE's Executive Director since April 2019. She is an Egyptologist, a specialist in faunal analysis, and I have traveled with her, and she will look at every single animal bone she finds on the ground. Loves it. And she's worked on more than 25 archaeological projects in Egypt since 2003. She obtained her master's in Egyptology from the University of Liverpool and a PhD in archaeology from Durham University. So I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Louise Bertini.
So good afternoon. And thank you all for joining us today. Very happy to see so many of you here. And we are honored to have your participation in celebrating the centenary anniversary of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by attending this lecture. Today's lecture is but one of many celebratory aspects that we are doing this year as part of this celebration of the anniversary. In addition to this chapter tour, ARCE, in partnership with the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, will be hosting Transcending Eternity, the Centennial Tutankhamun Conference, later this year from November 4th to 6th in Luxor, Egypt. And we are also partnering with National Geographic to provide academic expertise and programming for their Beyond King Tut immersive experience, which provides an integrated media experience in cities across the country and online. It will be headed to Atlanta in the coming months, so you can visit beyondkingtut.com for more information. Before we introduce our speaker, I want to take a moment to welcome those of you who may be new to ARCE. As an introduction, I'd like to share a brief video that provides an overview of our work for our nearly 75-year history in Egypt. There we go. So as you can see, ARCE is a multifaceted organization focused on fieldwork, outreach, partnership, and education, and supporting others working in the field. A special note regarding partnership and fieldwork, I'm excited to share an important update on a new project that we are embarking on at the site of Abydos. As some of you may know, Abydos is one of the most important burial sites of ancient Egypt that has a history extending back some 7,500 years. It was the cult center for the ruler of the dead, the god Osiris, and it was believed to be a physical gateway to the afterlife. In recent years, ARCE has committed significant resources to the conservation of different areas of the site and working in collaboration with our research supporting members. This year, ARCE's nomination of Abydos to the World Monuments Fund watch list was approved, and a memorandum of understanding with the World Monuments Fund was subsequently signed. Using seed funds, a collaboration between ARCE and the World Monuments Fund was launched with a dual focus: the physical conservation of the Osirian and Merenptah that lie immediately to the west of the Temple of Seti I, and the development of a management plan for the entire site. This work is made possible by so many of you. I'd like to express my gratitude to my fellow ARCE Georgia chapter members that are here today. ARCE has thousands of members across the globe comprised of Egyptologists, archaeologists, and many non-expert enthusiasts who simply find the history and culture of Egypt fascinating. If you are not a member, I encourage you to join and affiliate with our local ARCE Georgia chapter, and you can visit our table for more information. So now I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Betsy Bryan. Dr. Bryan is the Alexander Badawi Professor Emerita of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at Johns Hopkins University, where she has taught since 1986. She specializes in the history and archaeology of the New Kingdom Egypt, circa 1600 to 1000 BC, with a particular emphasis on the 18th dynasty. Thanks to her efforts, Hopkins has a vigorous graduate program in Egyptology, and applicants from all over the world have sought to study under her tutelage. Having traveled annually to Egypt since 1977, Dr. Bryan has developed a close attachment to the land and people. She is especially dedicated to training young Egyptian Egyptologists through the Hopkins graduate program. Dr. Bryan's dedication to strengthening the cultural ties between Egypt and the United States also finds expression in her activity on behalf of ARCE. She has served on multiple critical committees and working groups of the organization, and has served as ARCE's most recent president of the Board of Governors. ARCE in the field of Egyptology are better and stronger today because of her leadership, dedication, and scholarship. Currently, Dr. Bryan is conducting fieldwork in the temple complex of the goddess Mut in South Karnak. Her research there focuses on defining the earliest forms of the Temple of Mut at Ishuru. Today, Dr. Bryan will share with us her research on what life was like in the years between the reign of Amenhotep III and Tutankhamun. So if you now please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan.
Thank you so much, Louise, for those kind words, and I'm delighted to be here today. It's a great turnout, and I think the Carloses and ARCE together seem like a match made in heaven. So thank you so much for your attendance. And I just want to be yet another voice to tell you that if you haven't joined ARCE or the museum, I'm sure anyone would be happy to help. Okay, so as Louise and Melinda have said, this is a part of a series that ARCE is sponsoring because this is the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. Other people who are giving lectures are really focusing more directly on the reign of Tutankhamun or on the tomb of Tutankhamun. Mark Gabold, who gave some lectures earlier this summer, certainly did that. My role I see as being more to give you a larger context to understand how important was Tutankhamun, and most importantly, the tomb of Tutankhamun is full of gold. Why is it full of gold? And that is one of the things that I'm going to perhaps put in a few possibly new radical suggestions on that particular topic. So the way I'm going to approach this is to try and talk through this period of about 67 years. I don't know why I thought I could handle all that in one lecture, and look at what Amenhotep III did in the city of Thebes, which we all know was dedicated at this time to the great god Amun-Re of Karnak. How did he build and transform it? And then look at what his son, Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten and became what we often call the heretic king, and who closed all the temples of Egypt just to worship his one god, the Aten. What did he do to everything his father had done, and how did that change what Thebes looked like? And then what did Tutankhamun do in the aftermath of that? So that's kind of how we're going to be going through this. And this is the list of players. No one expects you. There will not be a quiz at the end. But the part that we have the most controversy about on this list of rulers in the 18th dynasty gets to be where we get down to the successors to Akhenaten or Amenhotep IV. For me, there are two kings or rulers named Ankh-Khepru-Re. The first one was a male who was probably the younger brother of Akhenaten, whose name was also Smenkhare. And the second was none other than his wife Nefertiti, who called herself Ankh-Khepru-Re Nefer-Nefru Aten when she ruled. So you'll just hear me refer back to this a little bit later. So now I'm going to try and move on. So just as we start, we want to remember, what is Thebes like at the time that Amenhotep III came to the throne? Now here's an aerial view. This is Karnak here. This is the west bank of Thebes. And if you've heard of Hatshepsut, the queen who ruled as a king, that is the bay in which her temple was built. But the main importance that we want to think about is that this is roughly the time around the 15th century BC. Egypt has been at war. Egypt has new wealth coming in as a result of having defeated Nubians to the south, and a little later, people from the Levant in the north. And Thebes is becoming a place dedicated to praising, worshiping, and developing the god Amun-Re as the national god of Egypt. So the Egyptians referred to Karnak by the name Ipitsut. It means the gathering of thrones. They also will say in their text that they refer to the house of Amun, the pair Amun. But that doesn't really mean the temple. It means all of the lands, all of the people, all of the herds that are owned by that particular institution. And so think about the fact that Thebes in this time is not just a series of a temple built to this king, but it is all of the land and all of the people. And if we look back at how this sort of city of Thebes was being transformed with all of this newfound wealth from their campaigning in the south particularly, we find that it's Hatshepsut, the woman who reigned as king, who was the first to really focus on creating a sort of new ritual city. And what she did was to build in Karnak temple itself here, and she built a new temple where I work at the Temple of Mut. This is the goddess Mut's precinct. And she also built a small shrine down here at what we now call Luxor Temple. And there were separate rituals that were celebrated over here. Now, one additional place that she built is her funerary temple on the west side of the river. And she didn't build it just to house her funerary cult, but here she also designed a temple for the goddess Hathor, where they could celebrate another very important ritual called the Beautiful Feast of the Valley. And in both that one and the one in Luxor Temple, the god Amun-Re of Karnak was a visitor. He would come during that ritual, his statue would be brought over. So Hatshepsut needs to get a lot more credit for actually having sort of created this ritualized circuit. And these are blocks from her so-called red chapel at Karnak that show the boat of the god Amun-Re being carried to different rest spots on its way to these feasts. But the king who really then gave more funding and resources to the Temple of Karnak than anyone ever before was in fact Hatshepsut's stepson. That is Thutmose III, who was her nephew and stepson. And he was actually a co-regent with her for the whole time that she was on the throne, but he was a little boy. And she just sort of, after a couple of years, shoved him into the background and ignored him for a bit. And when he grew up, he wasn't going to be ignored anymore. So he went out to campaign for more than 20 years in the military and brought back enormous wealth from the Levant. And he dedicated it in the temple of Karnak to the god Amun. And here he is right here making dedications. You might be able to see a couple of obelisks there that he dedicated. But I want you to really focus on all of this stuff, because these are all representations of gold and electrum and silver objects and ingots that he gave for Amun-Re to fill the coffers into these sealed treasuries of this particular temple. Now, in addition, we see that if we look at how Karnak actually changed from the beginning of the dynasty through the reign of Thutmose III, it goes from being a very, very small place, very small building, to then having its first stone pylon soon thereafter. Hatshepsut, she built a very, very large pylon. That's a gate, a huge gateway. But you'll notice it's on a different axis. And what she did was to point to the way for her rituals that she was building up. So this led you to the goddess Mut's precinct, where at the time of the so-called Opet festival at Luxor Temple, they would take Karnak, the statue of Amun from Karnak, they would go down this way, they would get the goddess statue from Mut, and then they would go on down to the Luxor shrine and have their celebration there. The same thing would happen when they went to the Valley Festival on the other side of the river. Now, suddenly we jump to Thutmose III, and what do we have now? We have a huge enclosure wall. We have a sacred lake, which hadn't been there before, and we have several new pylons. He built the 7th pylon, he built the 5th pylon, he built the 6th pylon. And so the precinct of Karnak suddenly is absolutely enormous. And not only that, but the priesthood of Amun is extremely wealthy. But it's not just the priests that are wealthy. In fact, the wealthiest people in this time period, these are some of the buildings that he contributed, were the people who administered the so-called Pair Amun. That is the estates of Amun, and they were called the stewards of Amun. They weren't priests. They were the people who counted all the herds and the lands and the people who were under the control of the temple. Now, that didn't necessarily mean, by the way, the gold. That was in the control of whoever got the seal. And the seal might not be in the hands of the stewards. But in any case, they were very powerful people. Now, Karnak was important for one additional thing in addition to Amun-Re, and that is that it was a place where the Egyptians celebrated the cults of deceased kings from the past. So it was almost a place, when it says gathering of thrones, it means the gathering of all these deceased and now divine rulers of the past to celebrate the time that they have given as rulers. And so Thutmose III was very active in building shrines for that all around Karnak Temple. Now, one last thing that he built, which was on the east end, is a temple called the Eastern Temple, because it's at the eastern end, which is where facing the sun rising, right? That's where the sun rises. And at that place, Thutmose III planned to put up a single obelisk, which we now call the Sol obelisk. And he actually never put it up. He had it made but it was found by his grandson lying on the ground 35 years later. And his grandson put it up and completed what was then the Eastern temple devoted to Amun as a sun god, with this sole obelisk as its feature. Now, the obelisk is a solar symbol already, but having just one focuses it onto this one emblem. And I'm going to return to that later. Now, this same grandson, Thutmose IV, is responsible for having built a courtyard in front of the Karnak temple and filled it with small buildings. So he is the last king before Amenhotep III who is completely focused on looking at Amun-Re's temple in Karnak. Now, in fact, he is so focused on it that whenever he is adding something, he has it depicted on his courtyard. So here he is. Amun-Re is the one with the plumes on his head. I can't really see it from the side here. I guess he's the one on the right. And then he's shown here seated, receiving from Thutmose IV all the things. And among the things that Thutmose IV donates to him is this little building, which is actually a porch right in front of the entrance to Karnak. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that we have in the tomb of the second priest of Amun, a depiction of exactly that same little porch. And I want to point out to you that it was gold. Now, this building was probably partially wood and partially stone and stood out from in front of the pylon. But the amount of gold that was actually being donated at this time is going up and up all the time and not coming down and down. In fact, the steward of Amun of the same time period depicts a huge wall of golden objects that he has. And guess what he has? He has the seal. So he controls the treasury. And even the second priest of Amun, his tomb is actually not nearly as large as the tomb of the steward of Amun. So now we have Amenhotep III, and we're going to look at how he altered Thebes. So right now, our focus is still purely on Karnak temple. Even the funerary temples that were being built in this time, with the single exception of Hatshepsut's, were quite small. And they were even built with brick pylons and a little bit of stone. So they were nothing to write home about. Amenhotep III did not live in Thebes. He was a northerner. So was Tutankhamun, by the way. And he probably never spent any time here until his third decade. But once he did, he moved here probably, in my view, he moved there and stayed somewhere around his 25th year, and he reigned until his 38th. And he began to build a brand new temple that is the Luxor temple, the so-called Ipit Resi. Now, I told you that Hatshepsut was already celebrating the Opet festival here. He took down her building and he built a brand new one. And he built it sort of from the rear forward. And he tells us in his inscriptions that it has, I'm gonna have to read it from on here, that it has been having walls of electrum and floors of silver, and everything being worked to the extreme. Now, I'm going to keep revisiting this point, but the fact is that we often skip past these kinds of statements on the part of people like Amenhotep III or Thutmose III, who tell us that they built this thing and covered it with precious metals. But in fact, they had all of that wealth. So what does Amenhotep III want to do here? He has swept away what was there and he has built a brand new temple. Now, this temple was for the celebration of the Opet feast, primarily. And the Opet was a renewal of kingship. Now, the kingship of the living king was renewed there over several weeks. The king went in The statues of the gods Amun-Re, Mut, and their son Khonsu went into the temple, and they were carried into the rear, and then they weren't seen again for a while. Now, what he added inside of Luxor Temple to the Opet Festival was this room, the room for the sacred marriage that took place between Amun-Re and his mother, Mut-Emwia. This had not been part of the Opet Festival, as far as we know, up until this moment, but it did seem like a very reasonable thing to do for him to literally be reborn as the son of the actual living Amun-Re inside of Opet, during the Opet Festival inside of Luxor Temple. When he emerged finally, he kneels down in front of Amun-Re, who then confers his crowns on him. And he is accepted as a renewed king. And this was so popular, let's say, with the kings who followed him, that for 1,500 years, people, including Alexander the Great, including Roman emperors, came to Luxor Temple to have the Opet Festival renewal take place. So this was a brilliant stroke on his part to take that and put himself in that place of being the son of Amun. Now, one other thing he did, though, is he added in the rear part of behind where the sacred marriage was and the Opet took place, a hall of columns. Now, this hall, instead, the rest of the temple is oriented north-south, but this is oriented east and west. And inside of it is a dedication that connects you when you go east-west to the other side of the river. Now it's not a connection to Karnak. Now it's a connection to temples that are on the west side of the river. And what is over there that it would be focusing on? Well, it's the temple of Medinet Habu, the small temple of Medinet Habu, where there is another kind of Amun-Re, who is an Amun-Re associated sort of with the earth itself. And it is, the decision was made by Amenhotep III to connect to that god. And if you then leave that hall and go into the Holy of Holies, what you find is that new Amun-Re that he worships in the back of Luxor Temple. And that Amun-Re is ithyphallic, and he is connected very much to the god of Medinet Habu on the other side of the river. Now, one of the things that's fascinating is in this scene, directly above this scene right here, is this one, which unfortunately I don't have a photograph of. But what you see the king doing here is the opening of the mouth ceremony. This means that he is quite literally initiating a brand new cult of the god Amun. This is not Amun from Karnak. This is the Amun that he has created and is dedicating here in Luxor Temple. Now, why do I want to comment on that? Well, the reason is that throughout his 20 years of building in Thebes, Amenhotep is not doing what everybody did before him and building in Karnak and offering to the god of Karnak. What he's doing is using the resources of Amun-Re of Karnak to build other temples. And he's actually creating new versions of that god while he's doing it. And it's all linked to him because it's all about renewing his kingship, making him the son of Amun. So it's a very interesting way of using the ritual pattern that they have of coming from Karnak down to Luxor, going over to the West Bank to Medinet Habu, going to the Valley Feast, and then going back. But what he's doing is putting the emphasis on the going away and not nearly so much on the coming back, because when they get there, they get to experience this brand new things that he has built. Now you'll notice even here, this statue, which is made of quartzite, you might be able to see those roughened patches. Can you see those? this is well known that this statue was completely gilded in antiquity. It was covered with gold, and the roughening is in order to keep the metals on it. So this would have been quite a striking statue of him. Okay, so now we want to take a look on the other side. This is where we're just looking at that he built the Ipit Resi. Now we're going to look at his funerary temple, which he built on the west side of the river. This is Karnak, and it's red because he hasn't even done anything there yet. What he built was an enormous space to celebrate the cult of him as an eternal king. The Colossi of Memnon that I know all of you all are going to be seeing. Many of you will be going on tours in the next 6 months, and you're going to visit the Colossi of Memnon. This is his funerary temple. But look, there's not just one set. There's actually 3 sets of these gargantuan statues with what had been pylon gateways behind them. And here we can just begin to look at the entire area of this region. Sorry, did I lose? Here, sorry. Yeah, so here's the side of the temple on that side. And here is a reconstruction by their conservators of what the area would have looked like. And here is their reconstruction of the overall. Nairi Hampikian, who was one of their architects and extremely capable person, has done this reconstruction. So here are the Colossi of Memnon, and then there's 3 sets of these colossal in front of 3 gigantic pylons, and then the actual temple behind it. Now, just the size of the space is there because it's wide open in order to house festivals. Now, the most important festival on the West Bank up until this time was, of course, the beautiful Feast of the Valley, which has been going to Deir el-Bahri, to Hatshepsut's temple. And now Amenhotep III even writes in his inscriptions that he wants Amun to come to his temple for the Valley Festival. This is the wonderful Horig Sarusian, who has been working at the temple for 25 years now. She's responsible for not only finding these new colossi, but also putting them up. I can't say enough about her. She's pretty colossal herself. And more of the colossal statues that she has rebounded with over the time. But another thing about this particular temple that Amenhotep III did is, aside from these gigantic images, and they're of him, of course, the Colossi of Memnon represent him, he had life-size stone statues made in the hundreds of other gods. And sometimes he would show himself with those gods, as he does here with the moon god, but sometimes it would be just the deity. But in all cases, there was a dedication on the inscriptional dedication that associates that god directly to Amenhotep. So by the time his funerary temple was done and the rituals were being enacted, he was actually connecting himself to every god in Egypt. The divine energy flowed through him and through them. But you could not separate him from the god Ta, the god Re-Harakti, the god Amun-Re. He was all of them, and they were he. And that was what he produced here. The last thing he did here, it kind of doesn't stop, is he created a statue cult. So when he made those gargantuan statues, the so-called Colossi of Memnon, on the back of them, he puts an inscription, and these things are named, and they have a name that turns them into a divine intermediary image. And his name of the Colossi of Memnon is Amun-Re, is the ruler. Amun-Re is his throne name, is the ruler of rulers. And he beckons people to come in front of these humongous images and make a request to him. And he will actually be the answerer, not Amun-Re of Karnak, Amenhotep, who resides in this particular place. Now, this particular one, which is more of a life-size statue, is also a named statue. It's Amenhotep, rulers firm and enduring forever, with that addition. This one, actually, I was lucky enough to make the join for, because the top is in the British Museum, and I found the bottom, which matches perfectly, in the basement of the Cairo Museum some years ago. He had a number of these statues that were actually divine forms of him that could be addressed by the people, and he wanted that to be the case. So by the time that we finished with this particular addition to Thebes, he has created this space for the celebration of the beautiful Feast of the Valley and for his personal Jubilee festivals, which he held in years 30, 34, and 37. And he has created these statue cults to make himself the focus of local pious admiration and worship. And he's identified himself with every god in all of Egypt. But nonetheless, since Amun-Re of Karnak is going to come there, and he even says this in inscription, I want my father Amun-Re to come and visit, he could charge Amun-Re's Karnak for the whole thing. Now, he also works at Temple of Mut, where I've been working, but he was much more clever when he got to Mut, because Hatshepsut had actually built the temple there. And we only have really the leftovers of this temple, sadly. But what he did, which was very clever, you could just see a little shadow, which represents the platform that Hatshepsut built. And her porch had these big square pillars on it. So what did Amenhotep III do? He just built one wall all the way around it, which he carved with images of himself offering to Mut and Amun-Re, and then put columns on a porch in front, and bingo, it looks like it's all his. From the outside, looks good. But he also, of course, dedicated statues to the goddess Sekhmet, both there and at his funerary temple, hundreds of them. And here is his addition there. This is the goddess Mut's legs, and you can't really tell it, but point of view that Amenhotep III was the first king actually depict Amun-Re in the Temple of Mut. Up until this time, this was just a person. So again, he brought Amun-Re of Karnak there, but really to focus the new worship that he wanted to promote in this temple. Now, he also finally, in the very last years of his reign, built something in Karnak. And that was a brand new pylon in the front of the temple, the so-called third pylon. And when he finally made that decision, somewhere around year 33 of his 38th year, he literally took down that court that his own father had built and filled with things. He took everything that was there and used it in the foundations of the pylon that he built. And on the eastern side of that pylon, he depicted the boat, the so-called barge of Amun-Re, on its way to the Mut temple to pick up Mut and to go on down to the new Luxor temple, which he had built to celebrate the Opet festival. Last thing he did, the very last, and he never finished it, was he started building a 10th pylon, which was on the way to the Mut temple. And so that would be up. I really can't see much of anything. Yeah, it would be this one. And he only got 8 courses of it finished, but he started, as he did it, to build a new statue of himself. He got his close courtier Amenhotep son of Hapu to direct this work. It was a 70-foot standing statue of him made out of quartzite. You can see the little kid who's just here at the bottom of the socle, and there's the sides of his foot. And he named this statue, another one that was a sort of god intermediary. He named this one, Amenhotep is Montu of rulers. Well, to us, that doesn't sound so unusual, except that it couldn't be more insulting. Montu was the other god of Amun, of Thebes, not Amun-Re. It was as if he were rubbing it right in their faces by calling himself the Montu of rulers, 70 feet high in front of Amun-Re's temple of Karnak. So that's the end of his work. This is what he had done. He created an enormous set of buildings to create a flow for rituals, but those rituals took the people away from Karnak for celebration. Now, I've talked again about how much gold and so forth this king had, and Thutmose III, all these people dedicating it. I want to just make one point here, which is that we shouldn't be too dubious, because a few years ago, in cleaning the floors right outside of Hatshepsut's suite around the main shrine of Karnak, they discovered that the sand on the ground was full of silver, which is exactly what they said that they did, which was to mix silver grains in with the flooring when they talk about working the floors in silver. So we really do have to take seriously when they tell us that they do these things. Now, one place that's very famous for that is the so-called obelisk of Hatshepsut, which is still standing. Do you see the color change? From that point on, it was wrapped in electrum all the way to its top. And at Dendera Temple, Peter Brand has written a wonderful article in which he discusses, you see all those little holes? This is how they attached sheets of solid precious metals in front of the face of the goddess Hathor. Well, Amenhotep III's marriage is exactly like that. Do you see the patterning here? What they did when they restored it after Akhenaten's people had really bloodied up Amun-Re here, they came in and they created big sheets of copper, because gold is just too soft to stay on a wall in that size. So they took sheets of copper and riveted it to the stone, and then fold the gold sheets around it. And these would not have been thin. We're not talking about gold leaf. We're talking about sheets of gold. So enormous amounts of wealth are going into these places. Now, the last thing I wanted to look at is the recent work of Zahi Hawass on the West Bank, because this was the city that Amenhotep III founded and lived in for those last 20 years of his reign, but also where his son was living and who continued to live for another 5 years after Amenhotep III passed away. And he built his city he called the dazzling Aten, or Amenhotep is the dazzling Aten. And it took up an enormous space on the west side of the Nile. In fact, now we know that it stretched all the way from down here where he had built a harbor and a set of palaces, all the way up to the funerary temple. And this is the area here where Dr. Hawass has been working and filling in a big gap for us of understanding how big this city actually was. In many ways, it was very much a model for the one that Akhenaten built at Amarna. Now, here's a little bit of a close-up of the area that Dr. Hawass works at. It's an industrial area, and with dozens of kilns, places sandal making was going on. They were bread making. These are querns for rolling out dough. These are more kilns here, and benches for leaning over to do work. And when we look at it from above, we also see that over here is a very interesting pile of stone. This is granodiorite. It's a stone that comes from Aswan, and it piles and piles of it, but it's debitage. It's what's left over after you've worked in stone. And this would almost certainly be where they were working on those wonderful statues for the temple of Amenhotep III. They left these piles and piles and piles of bits of debitage. So Amenhotep III passes away and his son is still there. And at that point, we actually can find sealings from the city that name him. This is his throne name, Neferkheppru-Re, and his second name was Amenhotep. But we have an even earlier one from before his father died that actually refers to him as the king's son, Amenhotep. So he was living, we know now, in the Middle Palace at Malkata, and is continued to live there for another 5 years after his father passed. In the storeroom where Dr. Hawass has been working and gathering materials, there are a lot of mud ceilings from vessels. This one does seem to actually refer to a pair. Now it's either Re or Aten, and it says numerous of rituals. So this could really very well be from the reign of Amenhotep IV, who will become Akhenaten. And this ceiling is equally interesting because it names not only the ibis-headed god Thoth, but also Aten again, and calls him beloved of Ankh-em-Mat. Now that means living on truth. And living on truth was an epithet for Akhenaten himself and for his god, the Aten. So it does seem that Dr. Hawass has got quite a bit of material that relates to the development of this brand new religion that Amenhotep IV is creating right there in Thebes at the end of his father's reign. So he really does change the landscape of Thebes. And the first thing he does to do that is to actually get access to people to quarry stone. He sends them to the great quarries at Jebel Silsila, which is a sandstone quarry well south of Thebes. And he left a large rock cut stela there from his very first year, where he is shown. Unfortunately, you can see it's been completely obliterated because after Akhenaten's death, most of his monuments were treated the same way he had treated Amun-Re during his lifetime. So, but this drawing was done in the middle of the 19th century by the Lepsius group. And what it shows is the king standing in front of Amun-Re with the plumes and making an offering. And the inscription starts with utterance by Amun-Re. So everything that the stela says is put in the mouth of Amun-Re of Karnak. And what does he say? He announces in here that they're quarrying stone to build a temple in Karnak for Re-Horakti, a completely different deity. And it's the Ben-Ben of the great Ben-Ben of Re-Horakti in his name of Shu, which is in the Aten in Ipit-Sut, then the name of Karnak. And so they actually one more time get away with having the temple of Karnak. Amun-Re of Karnak is now paying to have Re-Horakti move in and build his own temples right on the same area. And where did he build it? He built it at a place that I mentioned to you before, which is where the Sol obelisk is. It's the far east end of the temple. In many ways, it wasn't really in the temple proper. It was just outside of it. And he built it right here where the Sol obelisk was, and then he built the building around it. That building currently is one that Ramses II put up, but recent excavations by the French have shown that it replaced an earlier building. And now the French Chapaz and Carlotti and a number of others have suggested that this is indeed where Amenhotep IV's great benben to Re-Harakti was placed. A benben being a stone, a rounded stone that is a solar symbol and is often then turned into an obelisk form. Now this building, this is what it would have looked like. There was a platform and then they surrounded the obelisk that way. Was in a traditional style. There's blocks for it show his Re-Harakti, which is a falcon-headed god, and the king offering to him, looking very much in the same style as his father. Elsewhere, in one place in Karnak, in front of his father's pylon, he did leave one scene that he honored Amun in. But every other thing he did in Thebes itself was devoted to the god Re-Harakti and then Aten a few years later. Now, one of the things that we have to get into our heads now is that we think of him spending 5 years in Thebes, and he did. But most of that time, he spent trying to figure out how to raise money to build a new city. And he was not in control, from what we can tell, of the seal to all the treasuries. He had access to the Per Amun, so he had the people and the land, and he could do something with that, and that's why he had access to go to the quarries and send workers. But it's not until almost the end of his 4th year that we can say with certainty that he started building like crazy in Thebes. But what did he do? Well, he issued a lot of proclamations. He was very big on talking. And he did make a tax decree. Now, his tax decree was fascinating because it required every temple in Egypt to make a donation to his new god, Re-Harakti. And it set exactly what that annual amount was going to be for each temple. And these are some of the temples that I would take right out of the inscription. 1 deben of silver, 1 container of incense, a men container, 2 men containers of wine, 2 rectangular links of thick cloth. That's it. 1 deben of silver is 3.2 ounces. So this is nothing. In other words, he just simply does not have the clout to get the temples to send him what he wants. So where is he getting his money from? He's actually getting it from himself, his own estates, and his father's estates, which he's able to raid like crazy. And the last place that he was taxing were the mayors of all the major cities of Egypt. Now that he was successful at, because frankly, he could send police to rough them up if they didn't show up. The temples could claim that they were exempt, and so they didn't really have a problem. But the mayors really later on were complaining a great deal, which is why Horemheb, king at the end of this dynasty, had to pass an edict in which he sort of reversed all of this stuff. So he's working at it, but the fact of the matter is that he really does not have the resources to do it. And it's not until the very late period, late 4th year and early 5th, that he is able to now suddenly announce his new form of God. He changes from the style that he had been doing, a very traditional style. He makes his God into the Aten, the sun disk with rays coming down and hands at the end of the rays. And he changes the style of him. He places his god's names into cartouches, and he begins to build for that god outside of Karnak Temple on the east side, a brand new temple that is all open air. Huge platforms with altars that he would put food on, and then there would be then colonnades that had statues of him in it. So this is some of the decoration. Now, this is when he also invents this, or his people invented for him, stones that are very small, 56 centimeters in length, that could be carried by one person at a time, and they could build with them. Again, open air, so there's no roofing here. You can put it up really fast. And what he shows is him being honored by his god, and he shows lots and lots and lots of food, because this he has access to. And also bear in mind, what he has done in the 4 years that he's been there is not to worship at the Temple of Luxor, where the renewal of the kingship took place, not to go to the West Bank and do the beautiful Feast of the Valley, because he's not going to do anything on behalf of Amun. So he's been sitting over on the east end of Karnak pretty much all alone for 4 years. Now, that doesn't really work with a population that is used to going to festivals. That's how they got the best food of the year. Most of these people never got meat unless they went to a festival where it was served for free. So what did he do? He proclaimed that he was going to have a jubilee, a festival, and he celebrated that festival by inviting the population to come to East Karnak and partake. And that's one way to win over the people. And these were some of the things that he did depict. So he depicted all the food, and then he also depicted the festival itself, him being honored at his own jubilee. He also had statues of himself made. Now, this is interesting because this came from the so-called colonnade that he was building over there in the very last moments before he left to go to Amarna. And he had a whole series of these sandstone colossi made, but we now really have realized that they didn't look like this originally. Originally, this represented their surface. So in other words, they were traditional statues of him, colossal statues of him, that were then cut back to create his brand new art style. So he has this weird tiny little waist, a sort of barrel-like chest, a drooping belly, and a very, very long, narrow face. This extreme look is what he ended up with as he created this brand new art style. And he used his own statues to work it out and put them up in his temple. Meanwhile, as I say, all the rest of Karnak is now from year 4 and 5. He's now suddenly on the Talitat here. No longer, he now starts to call this Aten. That is, he calls Thebes Aten, the house of Aten. So he changes the name that used to be called the Amun, that is the estates of Amun, to Aten. And when he calls it Aten in the southern Heliopolis, which is the name for Thebes. When he gets to Amarna, he calls it Aten in Akhenaten, which is his name for Amarna. So he now somehow in late year 4 and early 5, he has now gotten access to at least all of the landed wealth, herds, and people that had been in the control of the Amun priesthood. But there's still not one shred of evidence that he ever got access to those sealed treasuries where the gold and the silver was. Now, I got really fascinated by this question, and I did a full search. If you search for the words gold, electrum, and silver, from the time that he left Luxor till the time that he dies. How many instances? One, and that is his electrum chariot, which he almost certainly had in Thebes and took with him to Amarna. There is not one reference to building or using gold in a royal inscription in the entirety of the Amarna group. And we have a lot of texts. So I think it's really likely that he simply didn't have any access to it. And so what did he do then the rest of his time? He started before he left attacking like crazy on Amun-Re and Amun-Re's wife Mut and anything that was their emblem. He had it mutilated. And after he left and moved to Amarna, he continued to do that until he died in his 17th year. He got more and more virulent as the time went on. But his changes that took place, here's more of it that he destroyed. Now, you see them there, but that's just because they were restored by others later. Now, when you see all of the blue that we had earlier, where Amenhotep III had built here, and he built here, and he built here, and all of this, the only thing that Akhenaten built is this little yellow. All the rest of this represents him mutilating the rest of Thebes. Then he dies, and we get the return to Thebes. Now, interestingly, the first ruler who appears from Amarna after Akhenaten's death is Nefertiti, Nefer-Nefru Aten. And her name comes up in a graffito from a tomb that Dr. Hartwig knows extremely well, the tomb of Pi-Eri. She wrote about it in a number of places. And that graffito actually names Ankh-Khepru-Re and also Nefer-Nefru Aten here. And it mentions not only that this is the third year of this ruler's reign, but it says that this ruler is in Thebes. And then it mentions that there is a temple in Thebes for Ankh-Khepru-Re. So we know that we should be looking for some place that was dedicated for Nefertiti as ruler in Thebes itself. It might have been taken over by somebody else. We don't know, but it is really interesting to note that it's there. Now, I want to just add to this. All of this is being written, giving praise to Amun, kissing the ground to Wennefer, that's Osiris, by the Wab priest, scribe of offerings, Hawak, scribe of offerings for Amun. So in other words, Nefer-Nefru Aten Nefertiti, in her third year, has already started abandoning Aten and worshiping Amun in Amun city. So even Tutankhamun was not the first ruler to start the restoration. Now, the other thing that we know is that Nefer-Nefru Aten's name had been on lots of the material found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. This is one example where you see the only thing that was original in these cartouches is the sun sign, because you can see that it's still the carnelian or red glass. The rest of it has a layer of gold that's been put on top of it in order to put a new name in. But when Carter was digging his way up to the door to discover the tomb of Tutankhamun, he hit a cache of material in the debris that had the names of other rulers in it. And one of them was this box lid, and it names the names of Akhenaten and of Ankh-Khepru-Re. So this would be Nefertiti and Akhenaten before he died. There was a whole group of material. None of it had precious metal, none of it. And what Nicholas Reeves has said is that he is sure that this was material that had been brought from Amarna after Akhenaten's death down to Thebes. That was what this cache of material was. Now, so if we talk now about Tut, he was on the throne for 8 years. Almost certainly he wasn't himself personally active in this time period. He was probably living up in Memphis, but I was working for him. And among the first things that he was doing was starting the restoration. This is the so-called restoration stela in his name, in which he says that the temples had been found in ruins and the gods were very unhappy. And so Tutankhamun is going to make it all right by making new dedications for them. That is what he is most known for outside of his tomb. His tomb is certainly more important than anything, but it is his restoration of the cult of Amun. And when he did it, not only did he start to have things fixed that had been mutilated, but he also dedicated large numbers of statues in the form of Amun, in this case, his consort Amenhotep. And he also brags in here and says, His Majesty took counsel with his heart, seeking every excellent deed, searching what was beneficial to his father Amun, fashioning his noble image of real electrum. And throughout the restoration stela, he talks about using precious metals, something Akhenaten does not say one time about anything that he built. Now, his restoration really was just that, things that had been mutilated. This was the goddess Mut. This is from our work at the Mut Temple. You can see all of the hacking that had gone on, and then it's been recarved with the face of Tutankhamun in front of, actually, this is King Thutmose III, or Hatshepsut. And another example of this is another artist, but of the same time period, replacing one that had been hacked away. So that is really an important element of what Tutankhamun was doing. But what else did he do? He really honored Amenhotep III. He wanted almost more than anything, or I in his place, to sweep away what Akhenaten had done. And to restore meant to honor the king right before that, who did build for Amun, even if he did it for his own good. So what did Tutankhamun do? He had images of himself placed behind the image of Amenhotep III on the pylon that Amenhotep III had built. And here's another example of him placing himself in that particular role. But he also added small little vignettes that show him in front of the god Amun on the bark, so that some of them say Amenhotep III and some of them say Tutankhamun. So he associates himself very, very closely with what probably was his grandfather. And another thing he did is, since Amenhotep III is active at the Mut Temple, Tutankhamun actually builds the Sphinx Alley that connects Karnak Temple's 10th pylon with the Mut Temple. And he makes this Sphinx Alley out of sphinxes of Akhenatens and Nefertiti's. So he is really rejecting, or I on his behalf is really rejecting, the whole period of Amarna. Now, lastly, he goes to the building at Ipit Resi, the Luxor temple, where Amenhotep III was so busy, and adds the decoration of the colonnade here. That this is the colonnade that actually is dedicated to the Opet festival, the renewal of kingship. And you have twin representations of him as you enter into that colonnade. Now doesn't look like a little boy, he looks like a grown man. So perhaps even this is one of the later images, or at least is meant to make him look like he's a grown man here. And represented in his colonnade are dancers and processions that are going to the Luxor temple from Karnak for the celebration of the Opet festival, including the barks of Amun-Re and of Mut, which are shown here resting when they got there. We also do have from Karnak some blocks that represent a building called the Mansion of Neb-Khepru-Re, which was his throne name. And these are blocks that have things like chariots. There is obviously the king is shown in a sort of military fashion, but there are also offering scenes. This particular building, Ray Johnson actually wrote his dissertation about, and some people have thought it was Tutankhamun's funerary temple, but the blocks have been found in Karnak Temple. So the big question we have is, where did it actually stand? I think these days the preponderance of evidence is that Tutankhamun did not build a funerary temple on the West Bank. I know Dr. Hawass doesn't want to hear that, but most of the evidence would suggest that if he had one, it was done by eye very late, probably as Tutankhamun was dying, and it was dedicated to him in Karnak Temple. So when we look now at all the things that Amenhotep III had done, we see that Tutankhamun was busy in at least a couple of those. This is still Akhenaten all over here all by himself. And when we finally get to the tomb, what do we get in that tomb? Lots and lots of gold, which I think the steward of Amun for the pair Amun under Amenhotep III, who lasted into the early reign of Amenhotep IV, Keruef, and worked for the queen, Queen T, I think he's the one who kept the seal on the treasury. Because I don't think that this is the gold that we have. Even when Tutankhaten was Tutankhaten, this chair was probably not made in Amarna. He was still Tutankhaten when the stuff was made for him there. And a lot of stuff was made for Nefer Aten, whom we see here. This is the queen, Nefertiti. Name changes. And finally, all of this. So who had the gold? This is Queen T, his mother, Amenhotep IV's mother. She had moved up to the Fayum. This is a statue of hers, and underneath this particular headdress, CT scans have shown us that she is wearing a solid silver and gold crown. Very, very royal-like. I suspect very strongly that they kept control over all of that sealed wealth so that when Tutankhamun's time came, it was there and available, and it was plenteous. Thank you very much for thinking.
That was brilliant. I've never heard of looking at the economic power of gold and how this lent itself to various things that happened in the reign, and then also the sacred landscape of Thebes. Well done. Do you, are any questions? Okay, well, I'm going to do it then. It is fascinating about Akhenaten not having access to the gold of Karnak, and I know that he had some texts where he it was pretty clear that he was having issues with the priesthood, and yet his father had all of this at his disposal. You know, is there any kind of trigger or a series of triggers that would have turned the priesthood off? Akhenaten, was it his new style of statuary? Was it, you know, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, first of all, I want to say that we may not be talking, we're not necessarily talking about the economic power of gold because they didn't use it as cash, but we do know that its prestige value in terms of diplomatic exchange and in terms of what you could ask for and get was very, very important. And also it had its own prestige value, just as the skin of the gods. I mean, that's what gold was for the Egyptians. And So the luxury prestige value was enormous. I'm sorry, ask me again.
Oh, so were there a series of triggers
Yeah, okay.
that turned the priesthood?
Yeah.
They took the key away.
I think it was, I think Amenhotep III got away with what he did, which, he was a megalomaniac. There's no question about that. But I think he got away with it because he never abandoned Amun-Re. Even if he was renaming cults of Amun-Re, it was always Amun-Re. And and maybe the fact that he built the third pylon was because he was feeling a squeeze to some extent. Because it's amazing how late the addition of his new pylon at Karnak really was. But in any case, I think that that's how he gets away with it. I think that the offense of Akhenaten is when he actually does go to Silsila and start building a temple to Re-Herakti just outside the main portion of Karnak, and really totally only give lip service to the god. And then after that, he's putting up these decrees. And we think these decrees were actually, on the sides of that monument around the Sol obelisk, because they're from the same set of blocks that came out of the 9th and 10th pylons. Obviously we don't know with certainty for sure, but I think we have to assume that when he is changing all the personnel very, very rapidly in charge of things, like, for example, he appoints a steward, right? Pa-Ren-Nefer, whose tomb we have in Thebes. Pa-Ren-Nefer never mentions the seals. He never mentions, again, having control over the seals, treasuries. But he has control over the herds and the lands and the people. It's exactly what I was talking about. So if you go through, I think it was the priesthood was recognizing that the only thing they could do was to sort of contain it. That's my speculation. And it is speculative, I'm telling you. Yeah. No, that would be the I who was they called him the God's father, which is really just someone who's an older, it might even been from the family, by the way, but Nefertiti's family. But he would have been acting on behalf of Tutankhamun to do that. But it was what I was saying when I mentioned that Nefertiti was already connecting with Amun, is that clearly that decision was made even before Tutankhamun came to the throne. They had made the decision they were going to restore the Temple of Amun. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that that was out of economic deprivation, but I don't think it would be surprising if it were, because we don't really have a lot of evidence that Akhenaten's religion was very popular anywhere outside of Amarna itself. And the temples that we have in the name of Aten from elsewhere are really, you can't really find a trace of them other than once in a while somebody's title that refers to it. You really can't really find that it had any lasting effect. Horemheb was a very powerful already in the reign of Akhenaten in the military, but he was kind of in a way kept at bay by during Tutankhamun's reign, and he had to sort of wait until Tutankhamun had passed and took the throne for 4 years before he could really assert himself. We don't know with certainty, but it looks as if Horemheb was actually in a bad odor with and Tutankhamun.
just want to ask one more question, then I'll go sit down. What do you think of the recent idea of Nick Reeves that underneath cartouche or tut is the name on Amenhotep III that says that this is
Underneath which
not
cartouche?
with the opening of the mouth. So that
Oh,
actually
oh,
the
oh, oh.
mummy is
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, I wouldn't want to dare say, because, you know, one would need to really take a look. I mean, that whole business of where Nefertiti is buried is a great one, you know, and I hope it gets more people to Egypt. Yes, I saw that too. I actually have no idea where he thinks the tomb of Nefertiti is. I'm guessing that he's putting it in the West Valley or someplace over in the closer to the Valley of the Kings. But I really actually don't know. I mean, he's trying to be very close. You know? Oh, okay. He thinks he has the mummy. Okay.
Oh, that's then the DNA test. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Can you just say the last thing again? I lost. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, of course, first we know about the Amarna period because there is a famous letter where the like where the Egyptian queen, who's called herself a widow, says that all her people is going to go there for son instead of she was married and some people have identified that with Nefertiti. Some people have identified that with the life of Tutankhamun, known, but I think that they're all aware that the site up in material and very well that but the problem was they had their own, you know, their own play with material. It was a very unstable period. So I think that the advantage of this all that. Now, according to the documentation, claim is that I do the same son or not enough to terribly make claims for the murder on the day. These are, you know, nothing except, you know, your side of it. So we don't really know the back of them. And it was very typical of the Nira to find a sort of preamble what the old side is next to that not that because there's a fact that fact. So I think you're you know, I think that the world at that time is certainly not like today, but it's difficult, you know. I think that they were more aware in the regard of what was happening